Isn't this just like old times?
In 1998, a little-known company named Valve released a first-person shooter named Half-Life and changed the face of gaming. Where other shooters struggled to provide even a semblance of a story, Half-Life had brains to match its brawn. A stirring tale featuring a realistic human cast as a protagonist that was more than a hand and a gun unfolded before the player's eyes as they progressed through each level. As Valve grew, so too did Half-Life's reputation, with Half-Life 2 in 2004 once again revolutionizing the genre, and its episodic expansions Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Episode 2 further raising the bar. The series didn't release consistently and occasionally suffered unexpected and painful setbacks, but when it did, it seemed as if Valve could do no wrong, until the series suddenly stopped. Shifting priorities, a lack of motivation, and other, more nebulous factors would lead Valve to put Half-Life on ice in the middle of its prime, leaving a generation of gamers adrift and an opus unfinished. And yet, Half-Life lives on, be it in the innumerable games and series it inspired, or provided the computative bedrock for, an undying stream of mods or other media based on the franchise. Half-Life's DNA is permanently embedded in the fabric of the video game industry and will likely remain so for some time. As sad as it is that a Half-Life 2 Episode 3 or a Half-Life 3 will likely never happen, and as frustrating as it is that Valve remains belligerent as to precisely why, the series, for the most part, has only really fallen out of Valve's hands. This is the rise and fall of Half-Life. In 1993, id Software turned the video game industry on its head with the release of Doom. The spiritual successor to id's Wolfenstein 3D, Doom dazzled players with its unique combination of fast-paced first-person gameplay and 3D environments. It launched a cultural phenomenon, established the first-person shooter genre as an industry mainstay, and inspired a legion of fans to create their own shooters, including two Microsoft employees named Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington. Newell and Harrington had both joined Microsoft in the late 1980s and had played a pivotal role in helping develop the tech giant's early foundational products, such as the OS/2 and Windows NT operating systems. Their work had allowed the two to accrue a small fortune, but rather than rest on their laurels, Newell and Harrington were eager to take a risk and start creating games. The release of Doom had convinced the two that video games were the future of entertainment, but it had also inspired a scattershot of imitators and successors that, in the young millionaires' minds, weren't living up to the medium's potential. Speaking to The Cambridge Student in 2011, Newell explained that while they had fallen in love with games for their phenomenological possibilities, for the potential they possessed in providing unique and meaningful first-person experiences, they felt that the industry was reducing the experiences to least common denominators rather than exploring those possibilities. And so in the summer of 1996, Newell and Harrington quit Microsoft to found their own development studio, Valve, in Kirkland, Washington, and gather the resources necessary to realize their ambitions. They obtained a license to the Quake engine with the help of Harrington's friend and then id programmer Michael Labrash. They hired promising talent from across the industry, and they secured a publishing deal with adventure game developer Sierra Online, which had been anxious to make its mark in the 3D gaming market. From Valve's very beginning, Newell and Harrington were determined to build their first game around its story. Unlike other contemporaneous shooters, which focused almost exclusively on action and graphical fidelity, Valve's first project, a horror-themed first-person shooter codenamed Quiver, would be filled with living, breathing characters and narrative-rich environments. Yet, at the same time, they also wanted to ship Quiver as soon as possible, fearing that if they took too long to craft their world, the rest of the industry would pass them by. They weren't interested in making a lavish blockbuster right out of the gate. They just wanted to release something good in under a year that would allow them to remain financially afloat. But as Quiver began to coalesce, Valve's storytelling ambitions took precedence, leading to several technological innovations and modifications to their Quake engine that shifted the project's direction. The need to have as many living, breathing characters as possible led Ken Birdwell, one of the game's software engineers, to design an innovative skeletal animation system that would allow the developers to cheaply manipulate their character limb by limb. Meanwhile, months were spent refining characters' artificial intelligence so that they would move about the map with lifelike realism. After the game, now known as Half-Life, received a rousing response at E3 1997, it quickly became clear to Valve that their title had the trappings of something truly special. As a result, the decision was made around Thanksgiving to delay the title to the following year and rework it into a game that would utterly fulfill its technological potential. In GameSpot's The Final Hours of Half-Life, Birdwell would claim that the team gutted nearly everything that they had worked on up until that point, effectively rebuilding Half-Life from the ground up halfway through the game's development. It was a painful process, both for everyone involved in the game's development and for Sierra, which became increasingly worried that Valve's inaugural project would never be released. But it was one that would prove fruitful. The rebuilt Half-Life received an incredible reaction at E3 1998, and an even more ecstatic response when it was finally released in November of the same year for the PC. Half-Life follows theoretical physicist Gordon Freeman on his first day of work at the Black Mesa Research Facility in New Mexico. Just as Gordon is getting acclimatized to the facility, Black Mesa transforms from a scientific wonderland into a house of horrors when a quantum experiment gone awry rips open seams in space to the alien world of Zen. Legions of frightening and powerful creatures, headcrabs, hound eyes, fortigons, and more flood the facility, devastating its employees and leaving Gordon with little other choice than to pick up a crowbar and start smashing his way to survival. The further Gordon progresses, gradually upgrading from his crowbar to all manner of firearms, the more complicated the situation becomes, with the military arriving to eliminate both the extra-dimensional invaders and the rest of Black Mesa's survivors. And in the midst of it all, Gordon finds himself repeatedly stalked by a mysterious pale man, the G-Man. Unlike other first-person shooters of its era, which relied on cutscenes or other conceits that took the player out of the experience to tell their stories, Half-Life's narrative is told entirely through scripted sequences that play out before Gordon's eyes, with the game never wresting control of its camera away from Gordon's perspective. Everything that the player experiences as Gordon progresses through Black Mesa, whether it involves shooting, standing still, or talking with other survivors, contributes to the game's overall narrative and helps realize Gordon Freeman as an actual character. The game's levels also heavily incorporate puzzles and platforming elements, forcing Gordon to contend with quagmires of conveyor belts, crates, tripwires, and more, in between facing off against his AI-controlled adversaries. They occasionally prove quite challenging and belie the design of many modern first-person shooters, which largely forego any sort of intensive puzzle-solving or platforming. But in the context of the game's cerebral nature and setting, their presence makes sense and give the experience a rather unique feel. Finally, as was common with other shooters of its era, Half-Life comes packaged with a multiplayer suite, allowing up to 32 players online to participate in Deathmatch and Team Deathmatch modes. Far from unique, but enjoyable for what it is. Half-Life would receive tremendous critical acclaim upon its release. Players were dazzled not only by the immersiveness of its world and characters, but by how the game seamlessly balanced them alongside its strong gunplay and puzzles, with neither side ever coming at the expense of the other. Characters, objects, and other imagery distinct to the game, such as Gordon Freeman, his crowbar, and the Lambda sign emblazoned on the game's box art, became icons overnight within gaming fandom. After an arduous and challenging development period, Valve had created a genre-defining experience that raised the bar for all future first-person shooters.
Outside.
In the years that would follow, however, the release of Half-Life would prove to be only part of the game's monumental legacy. Echoing id Software's legacy of encouraging mods of its own shooters, Valve strongly supported the game's mod community post-launch, including Worldcraft, the level design tool used during Half-Life's development in each copy of the game, and releasing a software development kit for Half-Life's modified Quake engine titled Gold Source shortly after its release. An explosion of impressive mods would follow, with some eventually graduating to full retail releases with Valve's help. Half-Life Counter-Strike, for example, a multiplayer mod which cast players as terrorists and counter-terrorists fighting to complete objectives or eliminate each other, would prove so popular that Valve would start actively participating in the game's development before recruiting its creators, purchasing its rights, and releasing it on store shelves. Other mods such as Team Fortress Classic, Day of Defeat, and Ricochet would follow similar paths, joining Valve's burgeoning talent pool and franchise portfolio, and in some cases, even receiving highly lucrative sequels, as would be the case with Team Fortress and Counter-Strike. In the midst of this, Valve would temporarily entrust the Half-Life universe to a fledgling developer named Gearbox Software. Formed the year following Half-Life's release by 5 former Rebel Boat Rocker developers, Gearbox managed to score the keys to the kingdom after one of the founders, Randy Pitchford, pitched a Half-Life expansion to Valve that would see the perspective on the game's events reversed. Speaking to Polygon in 2012, he described pitching the game to Valve as the events of the base Half-Life game, but in the style of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, with the game told from the point of view of one of the Marines sent in to silence Gordon. Valve approved, and in November of 1999, Gearbox would release Half-Life Opposing Force, which followed U.S. Marine Adrian Shepard during the military's assault on Black Mesa. Faithful to the base game's diegetic storytelling techniques and featuring a new Capture the Flag mode, Opposing Force would be well received by critics, prompting Gearbox Software to begin work on another expansion as well as a port. At this point, Half-Life's reputation had become segmented in the gaming industry, and other platforms wanted in on Valve's hot new commodity. In February of 2000, Sierra would announce that Captivation Digital Laboratories and Gearbox were jointly porting Half-Life to the Sega Dreamcast, and that it would include a new expansion centered around one of Black Mesa's security guards. It was not to be, however. After repeated delays, the Dreamcast port would be unceremoniously canceled in June of the following year, just weeks before its intended release date. Nonetheless, a near-finished build of the port would leak onto the internet a few years later, possessing modified level designs and unique models and props not seen in the original release, but also long loading times and an inconsistent frame rate. The abandoned port is an interesting curiosity. So much so that modders would attempt to recreate it as a mod for the PC version of Half-Life in 2012. Meanwhile, Gearbox's second expansion, titled Half-Life Blue Shift, would escape the Dreamcast port's demise, releasing by itself for the PC in June of 2001. Casting players in the shoes of security guard Barney Calhoun in an adventure in much of the same mold as Half-Life or Opposing Force, Blue Shift also came packed with a high-definition pack, which upgraded Blue Shift and the 2 preceding Half-Life games models with the models intended for the Dreamcast port. Critics' reactions would be more mixed. It was nothing less than a good game, but neither its design nor its new assets felt revolutionary in the same way the first game had. Gearbox's final work on the Half-Life series would come in the form of the game's PlayStation 2 port. Released in November of 2001, the port is based on the design of the Dreamcast version, but with most of its issues stabilized and ironed out. While it lacks its PC Brothers online functionality, it features a new local multiplayer mode titled Head-to-Head, the ability to play through the game's single-player campaign as a Vortigaunt, and Gearbox's third and most unusual Half-Life expansion, Half-Life Decay. Instead of sending the player on a one-man mission as a security guard or military personnel, Decay is a local cooperative experience in which 2 players embody Black Mesa scientists Gina Cross and Colette Green, who work together to solve puzzles and defeat enemies in an efficient manner. Like Blue Shift before it, the expansion received a lukewarm response, with critics knocking it for lacking the energy of the main game. Still, it was a welcome breath of fresh air after 2 very similar expansions, and it wouldn't be the last time that the Half-Life universe experimented with cooperative play. Decay would also be one of the few titles in the Half-Life series not released for the PC, with Gearbox's Patrick Dupree claiming in 2004 that a port of the expansion had been prepared for the platform, only for it to be canned for reasons beyond their control. In spite of this, Half-Life's ever-active community would take it upon themselves to port the title to the PC in 2008.
Gordon, snap out of it. You're staring at me again.
While Gearbox continued expanding on the first Half-Life, Valve was quietly beginning development of a full-blown sequel. Initially, spirits were high. While Half-Life's staggering success would be a tough act to follow, The team had plenty of financial security, and everyone was motivated to see how they could improve on the original game. After much brainstorming, it was decided that Half-Life 2 would outdo its predecessor by making its world as interactive as possible. Half-Life had enabled the player to manipulate materials within each level, but in a highly contrived manner, with Gordon generally only able to interact with a few pushable crates and other similar objects. What if the player could pick up a saw blade and fling it as a weapon? Or heave a chunk of debris in front of them as a makeshift barrier, protecting them from harm? The possibilities were endless, but the reality of how such a world could be realized was just one. Instead of further modifying id's Quake engine, Valve would essentially have to create its own engine from scratch. This, combined with a less than satisfying reaction to an internal demo created in 2001, would result in the sequel's development dragging on for some time. When Valve would finally unveil Half-Life 2 at E3 2003 with a technologically impressive, yet non-playable demo, reactions ranged the spectrum. Fans were over the moon to see Half-Life receive an official sequel, and doubly impressed with the game's physics and graphical fidelity. But some questioned whether the game would be able to meet its launch, which Valve announced would be in just over 4 months on September 30th. If the game was so close to completion, why was it not yet playable? Publicly, Gabe Newell would refute these fears. Privately, however, they were right. Valve's team had made incredible strides, but unless a miracle happened, they were not going to be able to complete the game by the time they claimed it would be ready. After months of denying the reality of the game's state, Newell would finally announce that Half-Life 2 would be delayed, a single week before its intended release. The community was in uproar. Business partners and publishers were dismayed, and Valve's employees were profoundly embarrassed. In GameSpot's The Final Hours of Half-Life 2, Newell would express regret over the way the situation unfolded. While they didn't want to announce that Half-Life 2 was delayed until they had a new release date to replace September 30th with, them repeatedly claiming that it would hit the 30th when they knew it couldn't wasn't such a great idea. It would have been better if they had never given it a release date at all, until they knew with confidence when it would ship. But then, as if things couldn't get worse, Half-Life 2's source code, along with a playable version of the game, would leak online in early October. A 21-year-old German hacker named Axel Gambi had sleuthed into Valve's network and downloaded them weeks prior. And just as Valve realized that they had been compromised, the assets were released online. The leak, the missed release date, and the ensuing fallout within both the Half-Life community and at Valve would prove to be one of the franchise's most tumultuous moments. And yet, slowly but surely, life would return to normal. Half-Life 2's development would resume in full force and gradually turn the game's broken narrative on its head with its appearances at E3 2004 and beyond. Valve's missed September 30th release date would remain a subject of infamy amongst the Half-Life community. But in the end, their new game would be redeemed. Released in November of 2004 on Steam, Valve's digital distribution platform for the PC, Half-Life 2 sees Freeman transported decades into the future by the G-Man into an Eastern European city known only as City 17. An interdimensional race known as the Combine have subjugated the Earth's population using Dr. Wallace Breen, Black Mesa's former administrator, as a mouthpiece to perpetuate totalitarian propaganda and control the planet's population. Eventually, Gordon finds himself recruited by the Resistance, an underground network of operatives working to overturn the Combine. Alongside Alyx Vance, a young Resistance member who accompanies Gordon throughout much of this, Gordon proceeds to once again swing, shoot, and puzzle his way to victory. Structurally and stylistically, 2 is largely identical to the original Half-Life, featuring an uninterrupted first-person viewpoint, elaborate scripted events, a blend of puzzles, platforming, and shootouts. Characters speak and animate with vastly greater realism. Buildings collapse and rend in the Combine's wake, and Gordon has access to a wider and wilder arsenal of arms. Chief among them is the gravity gun, which allows Gordon to grab, move, and launch most objects he comes across within the game's environments. Both the crux of many of the game's puzzles and a potential catalyst for catastrophic damage, the gravity gun is amongst the franchise's most popular and enduring conceits, even more so than the first game's crowbar. Half-Life 2 would prove to be a critical and commercial smash, once again setting the standard across the industry for the first-person shooter genre. and its legacy was only just beginning. 2 weeks after launch, Valve would release Half-Life 2 Deathmatch, upgrading the first Half-Life's multiplayer experience to contain 2's many new accoutrements. Valve had previously released a port of the original Half-Life to the Source engine in June titled Half-Life Source, with a Source port of the game's multiplayer titled Half-Life Deathmatch Source arriving the following year. But with the engine now out in the open, an incalculable wave of mods from the fan community would begin. This time around, however, the Source engine's most popular mods would be a little more thematically and mechanically varied than Gold Source's biggest successes. Plenty of them, such as Minerva, Get a Life, and Black Mesa, would continue Half-Life's harrowing narrative trappings and penchant for thrilling and varied action. Yet others, such as Dear Esther and the Stanley Parable, would forego action entirely, instead using the engine as a medium to meditate on the nature of 3D space and how it creates meaning for the player. Meanwhile, unique projects such as Gary's mod would offer players a playground to easily mess with the Source engine and Valve game assets as they please.
So is the goal still to sort of put out Aftermath in early 06 and then kind of keep following it up with sort of further episodic content going forward?
Yeah, we have right now 3, and we're starting a 4th single-player content team, so they'll be sort of, leapfrogging each other and releasing new content.
As development of Half-Life 2 wound to a close, Newell wanted Valve to focus more on smaller episodic content rather than attempt another massive undertaking right away. This way, the team would be able to flex their creative muscles while avoiding a serious burnout. And so, in the years following Half-Life 2's release, a bevy of robust content would be added periodically to the game's already strong legacy. In October of 2005, Valve would release Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, an additional level cut from the base game during development set in and around a Byzantine Catholic monastery. In addition to providing a brief escape into the twisted reality of Half-Life 2, Lost Coast served as a technology demo for the Source engine's then newly developed High Dynamic Range, or HDR, rendering capabilities. Bloom shading, stronger refraction effects on water, and other potent lighting effects are prominently displayed. Lost Coast also features a developer commentary system, allowing the player to trigger audio recordings of the level's developers discussing the design of the world around Gordon by interacting with floating text bubbles. This, in turn, would be featured in several future Valve games. The following month would also see an Xbox port of the game released, courtesy of EA. Generally regarded as inferior to the original release and lacking its post-release content, the port is otherwise serviceable. The following year would see 2 very different titles added to the Half-Life 2 universe. The first was Half-Life 2 Survivor, a multiplayer arcade game adaptation of 2 developed by Taito and released exclusively for Japanese markets in June. The game features 3 modes. Story, which loosely follows the base game's narrative across a series of bombastic set pieces. Mission, which forces networked players to work together towards a singular goal. And Battle, which mirrors the base game's deathmatch mode. Filled with intrusive tutorials, cutscenes, and colorful signage, Survivor is a bizarre outlier in the Half-Life universe, and completely non-canonical. As with Decay, Survivor would too be unofficially ported to the PC by ever-intrepid fans in 2013. The second was Half-Life 2 Episode 1. In 2006, Valve announced that they would be releasing a trilogy of episodes that would continue Half-Life 2's story. Episode 1, which would release in June, takes place in the immediate aftermath of the base game's ending, following Gordon and Alyx as they attempt to escape City-17 and protect its inhabitants as it teeters towards the edge of destruction. In addition to featuring a host of graphical enhancements, Episode 1 completely overhauls Alyx's artificial intelligence. More than just an integral part of Half-Life 2's narrative, Alyx now dynamically comments on both the player's actions and accomplishments, and the world around them as they progress. While overall not as beloved as the game it succeeds, Episode 1 would still prove popular with fans and critics alike. The following year would see the release of The Orange Box, a compilation of various Valve games both old and new, with Half-Life 2 and Episode 1 accompanied by Portal, Team Fortress 2, and Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Released for the PC and Xbox 360 in October of 2007 and the PlayStation 3 a month later, the Orange Box and its contents would prove immensely popular, albeit in some surprising ways. Episode 2 was as great as one might expect. Taking place in the wilderness surrounding City 17, the expansion features many of the technical and narrative advancements made in Episode 1 and then some, with inventive new uses for the gravity gun and an increased emphasis on open-ended environments sprinkled in for good measure. Episode 2 is the culmination of the entire series' strengths, the climax to 10 years of stellar first-person action and storytelling that, ironically, ends on a massive cliffhanger. And yet, players would end up being just as enamored, if not even more so, by the Orange Box's least known commodity upon its release, Portal.
Unbelievable. You.
Subject name here.
Must be the pride of.
Subject hometown here.
Taking place within the Aperture Science Research Facility, Portal casts players as Chell, a young test subject instructed to complete puzzle-filled rooms using a portal gun, which allows the player to rip holes in space and travel instantaneously from one point to the next. The further Chell progresses, the more the game's seemingly innocuous facade falls apart, with Aperture's robotic overseer, the enigmatic AI GLaDOS, revealing to be harboring disturbing secrets as to the facility's nature. Dark, cerebral, yet also bitingly humorous, Portal would win both critical acclaim across the industry and a spot in the hearts of Half-Life fans upon it being revealed to take place in the same universe. Its references to the latter are scarce, yet the few that are there are endlessly tantalizing, if only because they tease the possibility of the two series one day crossing over.
Okay, so they're obviously asking about Episode 3. Can you give us any news on that?
No, right? We don't have anything about Half-Life or Episode 3.
Okay, fair enough.
If the protesters couldn't get it out of us, you what?
In the aftermath of the Orange Box's launch, most believed Half-Life 2 Episode 3 was well on the horizon. When Valve first announced Half-Life 2's episodic trilogy, they claimed that the series would conclude by Christmas of 2007. It hadn't, but episodes were still coming in at a quick and consistent pace. Episode 3, logically, would not be far off. Yet, 2008 and 2009 would pass without so much as a peep from the Half-Life universe. Valve would repeatedly express its commitment to finishing the trilogy, claiming that it was taking its time to ensure that the series' final entry shocked and awed upon release. But no release date, nor any concrete details as to what players could expect from the title were given. To longtime fans of the series, Valve's reluctance to discuss the game with any sort of transparency was becoming maddening. But to Valve, it was purely precautionary. Newell would repeatedly express in the coming years that because Valve's projects had a proven tendency to undergo drastic changes well into development, they didn't want to waste consumers' time with information about their developing projects unless it was absolutely ironclad. After the drama surrounding Half-Life 2's release date, Valve only wanted to state concrete promises about Episode 3 when they felt certain that they could fulfill them. Until then, all fans had to go on was the knowledge that Episode 3 would involve Gordon and Alyx traveling to the Arctic in search of the Borealis, a research vessel created by Portal's Aperture Science. Possessing powerful and exotic technology, Gordon and Alyx would have had to decide whether to weaponize the ship for the rebellion's use or destroy it. Concept art that debuted in PC Gamer's November 2007 issue also seemingly confirmed that the Combine had already found and secured the Borealis, implying that Gordon would have had to wrestle control of the ship away from them first. Finally, after over 2 years of silence, fans would receive a slight reprieve when Valve would announce Portal 2 in the spring of 2010 for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. While the announcement would prove disappointing to certain fans, the game itself, which would release nearly a year later in April of 2011, would be anything but.
It's been a long time.
Set at an indeterminate point of time following the events of the first Portal game, Portal 2 sees Chell fighting for control of Aperture science from GLaDOS, eventually learning of Aperture's origins and the truth behind GLaDOS's existence. Fantastical new mechanics such as propulsive gel, bridges made from sunlight, and gravity-defying tunnels feature heavily, as does a chatty spherical AI named Wheatley.
Do you understand what I'm saying at all? Does any of this make any sense? Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped. But never mind, say apple. Apple. Okay, you know what? That's close enough. Just hold tight.
Bigger, funnier, and significantly more complex than its predecessor, Portal 2 would receive a rousing critical response, quickly securing itself as yet another classic in Valve's repertoire. As was the case with the original Portal, however, Portal 2's allusions to the rest of the Half-Life universe are fleeting, with the exception of a significant reference to Episode 3's Borealis during the game's latter half. While tantalizing, it would sadly prove to be one of the last times Valve would explore either series' universe. In the interim between Episode 2 and Portal 2, Episode 3's absence was frustrating, but it was far from dire. Valve had been painfully unclear at communicating when players could expect Episode 3 and why it was taking so long. But fans had weathered Valve's seemingly endless development cycles before and been rewarded for doing so. Half-Life 2 had gestated through nearly 6 years of development, while Team Fortress 2 had done so on and off for nearly 9, and yet both emerged none the worse for wear when finally released. Moreover, Valve's continued commitment to the Portal series showed that the developer still cared about crafting deep, story-based single-player adventures. But as the years would pass following Portal 2's release, the future of Half-Life would gradually become less and less certain. Valve would continue to publicly affirm their support of the Half-Life franchise's continuation, with director J.J. Abrams and Newell even expressing interest in collaborating on Half-Life and Portal movies at the 2013 DICE Summit. And like clockwork, wisps of information implying the continuing development of either a Half-Life 2 Episode 3 or a Half-Life 3 would continue to seep onto the internet by all sorts of means, from leaked concept art to project tracking software, text files, and even t-shirts. Yet all the while, a small exodus of prominent Half-Life developers would sweep Valve, with Viktor Antonov, Half-Life 2's art director, departing in 2012, Ted Backman, who designed much of the series' iconic enemies, departing in 2015, and series writer Mark Laidlaw departing in 2016. For a company of Valve's size, which is known to currently employ well over 300 employees, a few departures is hardly a drop in the bucket. The company is far from short on talent capable of creating a new Half-Life title, but the specific nature of these departures suggested that, talent or no talent, there perhaps no longer existed a place for Half-Life at Valve. Tellingly, Antonov would explain to Eurogamer upon his departure that he had left Valve because it had grown large and ceased to create epic AAA titles, and that he personally yearned for a sense of intimacy and creative risk that he felt that Valve no longer offered. His statement contained a lot of truth. Following the launch of Dota 2 in 2013, Valve's video game releases would largely slow to a crawl, with the studio focusing much of its time and energy on developing Steam, which continued to expand at an incredible pace, as well as maintaining its most popular online experiences, namely Dota, Counter-Strike, and Team Fortress. The company also became increasingly engaged in developing and managing physical hardware, such as the Steam machines and the HTC Vive. Long gone were the days of Valve needing to ship Project Quiver as soon as possible to remain ahead of the curve. The Valve of today could still thrive without so much as releasing a single game. However, Valve's refusal to work on a new Half-Life title may be rooted in more than the company no longer needing it for financial support. In Andrew Reiner's 2017 Game Informer article, Searching for Half-Life 3, Reiner would relay a conversation he had with an anonymous Valve employee, who claimed that numerous Half-Life projects, some small, some large, had sprouted internally over the years since Episode 2's release, but that they had repeatedly failed to maintain any sort of long-term momentum. A lack of collective excitement, office politics, and shifting directions internally sabotaged the series again and again, with each project's collapse making each subsequent project harder and harder to get off the ground. While worth taking with a grain of salt, the anonymous employee's claims, if true, provide an encompassing explanation for both the company's evasive attitude towards the Half-Life series' future, as well as the seemingly endless drip feed of leaks that have emerged over the past decade. In August of 2017, Mark Laidlaw would unexpectedly post what many believe to be a plot synopsis of what would have been Episode 3's story to his personal website. Titled Epistle 3, the piece recounts the adventures of Gertie Fremont and Alyx Vaught and their fight against an alien menace known as the Disparate as they attempt to board a ship known as the Hyperborea. After much ado, Gertie and Alyx successfully board the Hyperborea and attempt to drive it into and destroy the Disparate's invasion nexus. But before they can, Alyx is whisked away by the elusive Mrs. X. Gertie, likewise, is deposited onto a beach seconds before her annihilation at a nondescript time and place. It's unclear whether Epistle 3 represents what Valve officially intended Episode 3's story to be before the project was sidetracked, or merely Laidlaw's own personal aspirations of what he wanted the story to be. Regardless, to many fans, the piece finally provided much-needed closure and a seeming confirmation of the franchise's fate. Half-Life may very well live again one day, but if it does, it'll be unlike anything before it, and created by a team unlike the one present during the franchise's heyday. Heartbreaking as it might be, the franchise still continues to be supported by a voracious and active fan base, one that to this day continues to fuel the lifeblood of the Half-Life and Portal universes with innumerable fan games, mods, short films, webcomics, and much more. And for as much as Valve refuses to touch either series themselves, they've continued to remain open to leasing their characters and worlds to other developers. Not all of these projects have done the series proud, but enough will to ensure Half-Life's enduring legacy for a long time to come. Our work is made possible by the generous support of our patrons. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and checking us out on Patreon. Thank you.